curriculum experience in Canada, and brings together directors as well as graduate students from 3 different digital media and technology research labs in Canada. And I was struggling with words to describe, are these maker spaces, are they digital media centers for practice-based inquiry? And I really struggled with the vocabulary. I think in some ways that the curator at the Pompidou Center struggled with, talked about the struggle with new media. So hopefully our presenters will be able to extrapolate on my definitions. But all 3 programs that they represent, the Critical Media Lab at the University of Toronto, the Critical Making Lab at the University of Toronto, the Critical Media Lab at the University of Waterloo, and the Mobile Media Lab at Concordia, they all have a practice-based component as I see them, and are, I think, as well interdisciplinary practices and programs, which border, I believe, on disciplines such as information technology, media studies, design, or engineering in some cases, as well as more traditional humanities fields such as literature and the fine arts. I asked the panelists when convening this panel to use this opportunity to reflect on the role of making or practice-based media inquiry, understood here as a hybrid conceptual material practice supported by humanistic theories and assumptions within the context of their work in the university. So what, for example, is the pedagogical or epistemological value of making or practice-based inquiry as a complement or as a translation of traditional practices from within the humanities? And part of the origins or inspirations for this panel as well was a comment, a critical piece written by Richard Grusin, a new media theorist, where at an MLA conference a few years ago, critiquing what he saw was some fetishization of coding and these material practices, and he made an intervention, saying, well, writing is a material practice, writing is a media practice, etc. So this was a way to kind of flesh out some of these discussions. So I've asked to be a ruthless moderator, so I'll begin with our first presenter, Ginger COONS, who is a research associate at the Critical Making Lab at the University of Toronto, and will be presenting a paper called The Productive Contradictions of Critical Making.
Thank you, Nick. All right, so what was a tiny bit alluded to in that introduction, I don't think there are other graduate students here. So at the time that this panel was submitted, I was a graduate student at the Critical Making Lab, and now have the honor of being the first person from the Critical Making Lab to leave it with a PhD. So we've pushed out master's students before, but never a PhD. And Matt Raudo would be here, but unfortunately he was unable, and he is the director of the Critical Making Lab, and, odd to say it, my former supervisor, and now boss. So, here we are. So the Critical Making Lab has been around at the University of Toronto for about 8 years. In various spaces, we've moved from little rooms to yet bigger rooms, as the institution discovers that we have value. So, go figure. We're Matt's brainchild. When he came to U of T, he put a rider into his contract that he required space to pursue his research agenda. And so the Critical Making Lab and now the Semaphore Cluster on Mobile and Pervasive Computing, which is a mouthful, both share a space and fulfill a mandate of being practice-oriented research centers within a traditional social science faculty, which is the Faculty of Information, formerly the Faculty of Library and Information Science, because we're very much part of that change in the way the institution sees things that it used to see as valuable. Go figure. But I won't talk about 3D printers in libraries, because that would be boring. We conduct research into a variety of issues, which I'll mention in a moment, but what's structurally important is we have a director, Matt. We have a set of postdocs on a revolving basis. So in this photo, the guy in the plaid is one of our former postdocs. And we have PhD students like Antonio in the photo, and formerly like myself. We have master's students who are sort of ground forces. We have affiliated researchers and guest residents, including experts in residence like a industrial designer who is currently occupying one of our cubicles. And we have research assistants who come in on a project-by-project basis. Now, what's interesting about this, in relation to one of the talks yesterday, I've forgotten the name of the woman who was talking about it, but she mentioned this issue of interdisciplinarity as being situated in people versus being situated in sort of collections of people. And what's interesting or odd about the Critical Making Lab is that we do both of those things. So before I turned up at U of T 6 years ago, I had studied graphic design and was interested in the standards for spot color. So my master's thesis wound up being on spot color, as you see in this lovely photo of my messy desk in the former Critical Making Lab when we were in a basement. But we also represent interdisciplinarity in collections of people. So we have historians, we have software engineers, we have aerospace engineers, we have people who have come from a huge variety of programs and who have turned up in either our master's program or doing PhDs, who then meet and collide with each other in productive ways. I like to say that in our interdisciplinarity, try saying that 5 times fast, we're very much like magpies, in that we grab up bits and pieces of theory and knowledge and information that we find useful at a given moment. And maybe that's an overly derogatory way of talking about it, but I quite like the image of flitting around and seeing things that we find valuable and picking them up and bringing them to our nest. And so in large part, we're situated in many of the concerns of science and technology studies, which is the sort of intellectual heritage that most of us are indoctrinated into by our shared supervisor from the student perspective. And we talk in those areas, right? For many of us, 4S is our home conference, if we had to make that kind of decision. But we're all over the place. What's important here and interesting is we see Tim Ingold, for example, who is really, far more traditional and not in our field. He's an archaeologist, in effect, and we see something interesting from him. He says, could not such engagement, working practically with materials, offer a more powerful procedure of discovery than an approach bent on the abstract analysis of things already made? And coming from the social science side of things, that's a provocative thing to say. It's very provocative to suggest that we should work with the materials, not just with texts, not just by watching what people do, not through those traditional social science methods. And I like to say that one of the things I find most valuable about critical making is its ability to make systems legible and empathizable. So, by devising a new system, we're forced to think about the structural constraints and why those constraints exist. So I should roll back for a second and explain vaguely what I mean by critical making, because it's this sort of research position that we've been plugging away at. Matt laid out its first devising, but obviously you can't just follow precisely in the footsteps of the people you learn from, and so he has had many productive and sometimes heated conversations with other scholars and with his students over the last 8 years, and I think we have a multidisciplinary form of critical making now at this point. But what we do in critical making, for the most part, and historically, has been we produce artifacts, we work on sort of, I say, metaphorical systems, although the use of metaphor as a metaphor is something that Matt and I have come to a head about many times. We use these sorts of physical metaphors. We produce things in order to explore complex socio-technical systems. So that's what I mean when I say that by devising a new system, we're forced to think about the structural constraints of existing systems. A good example of this is the Handshake Mittens. So these secret Handshake Mittens, which are a workshop that we did first with a group of children to teach them about soft electronics, actually turn out to be a really interesting metaphor among older participants for talking about things like belonging and trust. Because the structure of the project is you and a partner come up with a secret handshake and then build the mechanics for that handshake into a pair of mittens. And when you successfully reproduce the handshake, an LED lights up. So, really simple little thing, but it's this idea of building a metaphor for a larger social issue or system into an artifact. Better example. So there's also the critical making class, which takes place in the master's program in the Faculty of Information. And one of the assignments, one of the long-standing assignments, is to create a moral technology. And the example that Matt would give you if he were here, because it's his favorite example and he always uses it, is the traffic light. So one year, I think about 7 years ago now, a group of students produced, in response to the brief of create a moral technology, a traffic light. Because they felt that the traffic light imposes a set of morals on its users, but also imposes a burden of being moral themselves by respecting the traffic light. Now this is in response to Bruno Latour's article about the sleeping policeman, actually, if anyone knows that one. The speed bump is a sleeping policeman, except that, though it's a response to that, the traffic light is far more voluntary than the speed bump. Because if you go too fast over the speed bump, you will notice a difference. You know, you may lose your muffler, right? Or experience an unpleasant bump. If you don't stop for the traffic light and there's no one else there, who but you knows that you've actually done something immoral? So, we move on. And this is where maybe I'll get a bit more practical. So there are some tensions in doing this kind of work in a faculty and in a discipline that is used to seeing writing as the output. And this has been a move in critical making over the last number of years. So when Matt started out, the idea was that you would produce these things, but you would not produce them as persistent objects. So in the early days of critical making, one of the requirements of the project was to take it apart afterwards, because Matt wanted to avoid, in fact, the fetishization of the object, which is something that comes up quite frequently, and which is something that when I turned up, coming from a design background, I found very puzzling. But there's a nice logic to it, because if you focus too much on the finished object, you may not necessarily, if you're not trained to do it, have as valuable an engagement with your process, because you're too focused on will it look good, which is the level that many master's students in library and information science often encounter building at, right? They're so focused on the exciting new skill they're learning, they're focused on making the blinky light on the Arduino work, that they're not thinking necessarily about the socio-technical systems that they're meant to be thinking about, or the issues they're meant to be thinking about. And this is where the Liberator comes in. So I don't know how many of you are aware of it, probably all of you. It was very big in the news about 2 years ago. A guy in the US, a law student in Texas who had something to prove, designed a 3D printable model of a working handgun, and it's called the Liberator, and you could download the files for it. And we did, of course, because, you know, if you have a room full of 3D printers, you'd be a fool not to download the model of the working handgun. We printed a version of it that is non-functional, because that's kind of important by law in Canada, since you're not actually allowed to manufacture firearms without a permit. And the prevailing response from people in our faculty, from professors, from students, from, our PR person had a horrible field day with it, the prevailing response was, why have you done such an awful thing? Why have you decided to make this handgun? That's a bad use of 3D printing, which is exactly the point. We're engaging in a really potent ongoing discussion. And in addition to going through the process of seeing how this is done, because this thing cost about $200 of material, it took 16 hours to print, it was exceptionally difficult to assemble afterwards, and so on and so forth. It was a very complex process that destabilizes the idea that now anyone can print a handgun, right? It's easier to make a pipe gun than to make this. And the pipe gun is probably better, frankly, since this is made of plastic. But what's interesting about it is, for us, it's an interesting research outcome. It gets us good papers, which is always nice. It gives us a chance to think about something productive and complex. But if you look at the object, what you see is bad, right? You have made this awful thing. So that's been interesting for us. Conversely, this gorgeous photo that I regret frequently of a little girl in Uganda named Rosaline, who is wearing, as far as we know, the world's first 3D printed transtibial socket, which means she's wearing a portion of a prosthesis that has been 3D printed based on a 3D scan of her leg that was then modeled by a prosthetist. And what's interesting about this one is we in the Critical Making Lab have not historically done work which has durable outcomes. And about 2 years ago, we started in on this partnership project, which engages with an NGO and a hospital and Autodesk to design this workflow for 3D printing prosthetic legs in places where it's currently too slow to make a prosthetic leg. And that's a mobility issue. And in producing something durable, we've had to confront a huge collection of issues that we hadn't confronted before, when we weren't doing things that were meant to be thrown out into the world and used, when we were just thinking with objects. One of the issues being, someone actually said to me when we first started putting out photos from this, "Thank goodness you're doing something nice now after that gun," which is interesting. And if anyone's going to be at 4S next week, I don't know how much of an intersection there is, 2 colleagues of mine have made a delightful project, which is the moral vending machine, in which you go through a series of structuring questions that help you think about morality in 3D printing, and at the end you get a keyring of either a tiny non-functioning Liberator or a tiny 3D printed prosthetic leg. So one of the fascinating things in doing this kind of work that does intervene materially in spaces where the social sciences is not used to intervening, is seeing, the things that are, in a common sense way, good or bad, and seeing those differently. For us, this is a very productive project, but it's got a different set of assumptions and problems around it than the Liberator does. So with the Liberator, we got to think about a lot of fascinating legal issues. With this, we get to think about a lot of fascinating post-colonial issues and technology transfer issues, which are very much eclipsed when people say, "Isn't it great that you're helping children in Uganda?" Which, not necessarily, it could be horrible. Anyway, so, bottom line, there is this question that is occurring to us in the Critical Making Lab increasingly frequently, which is, how do we continue to reflect critically on our processes and on the things that we're making when we start actually implementing our interventions? So this is something that I think we contend with in a way that is less familiar on the art side of things, given that, at least my background, my BFA taught me to produce things and document things, and taught me that I should have output and could have output. And for us, in the Critical Making Lab, we are incredibly uncomfortable with that idea for ourselves, since it's an entirely process-based process, or has been up to this point, as we now look at beyond just how we can use production as a way of talking to other people and figuring things out for ourselves. What happens when someone becomes divorced from the production process and just has the artifact to understand from? This problem of when people think that the artifacts speak for themselves, rather than encompassing this entire history of engagement, what then? And I think I have a couple of minutes left, but I think I'll wrap it up there for the sake of tidiness. Yeah.
So I'd like to move on, but because you stopped a little bit early, if there's any immediate question or comment based on Ginger's talk, we could take that quickly. Sure.
The guy spaced out, but did you? So were these like prototypes and again like investigations of concept, or were they meant to be shipped and used? I didn't quite catch that.
It varies. The legs are actually in the middle of a pilot right now
Okay.
at a hospital in Uganda
Okay.
that we're working with.
Okay.
But this is the first time we've ever shipped anything, and as I say, we're incredibly uncomfortable with that.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, well, we'll go on to Marcel of Mormon, who is founding director of the Critical Media Lab at the University of Waterloo, as well as an associate professor of English literature.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, Nick, for setting up this discussion. I'm really looking forward to talking about some of the possible ideological differences between our labs, and in addition to the practical differences. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion about that. As for my presentation, I'm not really sure what's on these slides. Hopefully it will make sense. I'll do my best. Just to introduce the Critical Media Lab, the lab has been around the University of Waterloo since 2007. Similar kind of story. Started in my office until I had funding in 2008, fortunately, through a CFI grant, but I had to call the lab a visualization and biotelematics environment in order to get the funding. And that allowed me to move off campus and to make it a more interdisciplinary kind of thing. So the lab is currently in downtown Kitchener. We've been through a series of storefronts where I just signed leases in back alleys, and finally have kind of institutionalized, and now the lab is in a space called 44, which is adjacent to a bus station in downtown Kitchener, and we're in the space with the Accelerator Center, which is an incubator, and Conestoga College Media Arts programs as well. So we share the space. It's a studio exhibition space, laboratory, and it's also the headquarters of our experimental digital media master's program in the Department of English. So there you go. So my title is Technoromantics, Maker Culture, and Critical Neo-Luddism. And coming from a Department of English, my background, my story is a little bit different, perhaps, than that of the Critical Making Lab. So I want to start with a couple of quotes, and I really want to talk about the arts and crafts movement, and it's kind of chart this genealogy from the arts and crafts movement to the contemporary maker culture. It's a quote from William Morris, where he basically discusses the difference between useful work and useless toil. It's an essay from 1881, a very kind of utopian socialist essay. He concludes by saying not only his own thoughts, the worker's thoughts, but the thoughts of the men of past ages guide his hands, and as a part of the human race he creates. If we work thus, we shall be men, and our days will be happy and eventful. So in spite of the rhetoric of manliness here, he's really speaking of humanity and the humans need to create. Jump forward a few years, you have David Gauntlet saying, it's the fact that people have made a choice to make something themselves rather than just consume what's given by the big suppliers that is significant. Amplified slightly, it leads to a whole new way of looking at things, and potentially to a real political shift in how we deal with the world, equally political and equally kind of utopian way of thinking about handicraft. And then Anne Balsamo in Designing Culture, based on analysis of how imagination unfolds throughout the designing process, I speculate about what is required to educate and inspire imaginations that are as ingenious in creating new democratic cultural possibilities as they are in creating new kinds of technologies and digital media. So once again, this relationship between making politics and building some kind of ideal economy, ideal world. So rewinding a little bit, I just want to say a little bit about where the trajectory that my own work has taken, because it speaks to why I founded the Critical Media Lab. So this book, eCrit from 2006, is really about challenging the discipline. When I say the discipline, I'm talking about the humanities in general. The book is it really says that we need a new kind of scholarship. The humanities must go digital. So quote from the book, a large portion of the study involves an attempt to create a new method of scholarly research that is more suitable to a picture-oriented, digital-centric culture. eCrit is a glimpse at what knowledge production might look like after deconstruction in an age of computer-mediated communication. So really, eCrit, following, maybe stumbling a little bit in the footsteps of hypertext theory, but trying to ameliorate some of the emancipatory rhetorics of hypertext theory, and proposing different methodologies using digital media, web-based methodologies, some of them based on the work of William Blake, which we'll talk about in a minute. I won't talk about that. But my work underwent a shift. I'm talking about my work not to be megalomaniacal, but to talk about the ideology of the lab. It's not anymore about needing a new kind of scholarship. The humanities must go digital. It's more about challenging the culture rather than discipline, saying we need a new kind of digital culture. The humanities must go outside. So the question here is taking the lab off campus and putting it next to a tech incubator in downtown Kitchener to create some kind of, I wouldn't even say cross-fertilization, I would say to hopefully create some kind of infection of critical thinking and critical practices into the world of entrepreneurship and hardware startups. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to skip this, I think. The first kind of project that I would call a Critical Media Lab project that I created was Dreadmill. And Dreadmill kind of embodies the approach to making that we work on in the lab, that we follow in the lab. It's basically a treadmill hardwired to a computer. This uses a PIC microcontroller created in 2004 while I was still at University of Detroit. And I run and give a lecture of 5 to 7 kilometers on the treadmill, and my speed controls the speed of a video. And it's a form of embodied rhetoric and kind of a way of doing critical technological studies, critical media studies, while actually developing new technologies at the same time. So the Critical Media Lab supports interdisciplinary research creation projects that draw on new media to investigate the impact of technology on society and the human condition. So it's kind of an ironic relationship to technology where you're trying to take new technologies, whether they be off the shelf or things developed locally in Waterloo, for example, in R&D, and using them to be more reflective on technological impacts. So with that in mind, it does involve a hacker and a hacker kind of aesthetic. So what is a critical media project? Ask the question, yes, but is it art? But the question, I guess, is yes, but is it digital humanities? I've been asked this question many times. Critical media projects are whatever helps make objects to think with. So this is the thrust here, is that the practice of making these projects is a reflective practice. And you saw that quote from Tim Ingold that Ginger had up there as well. So we would absolutely champion that way of thinking as well. There are some differences. The projects are a combination of philosophy, rhetoric, criticism, literature, art, computer science, and engineering. And some of you who know the work of Catherine Hales would understand this idea of a generational shift between hyper and deep cognition. The projects are meant to foster both kind of a hyper-cognitive way of thinking, but also more reflective ways of thinking as well. And in that sense, the Critical Media Lab fosters practices of reading, making, contemplation, and writing. So very often what will happen in the lab, whether it's MA students, PhD students, or faculty from a number of disciplines, they bring a problem to the lab that is rooted in readings that they've done. They're humanists primarily, so they've done readings. They want to embody some kind of problem in a digital media project, a reflective digital media project. So it involves reading and then making something, an object to think with. That's a term I borrowed from Sherry Turkle, by the way, who borrowed it from someone else. I'm not sure who, but no one knows. So reading and then making, and making is a form of contemplation, and then ultimately writing about these projects. So the Critical Media Lab, I mean, we don't abandon the practice of writing as a form of making as well as a form of contemplation, reflection, and cognition. So on to the idea of Neo-Luddism. This is where all of this is bringing me, I guess. Is anyone familiar with the Luddite movement, 19th century, early 19th century? Some of you probably are. Primarily during, between 1811 and 1807, these were workers in textile factories who did not like the mechanization of labor that was going on in their factories, and they did things like destroy frames or threaten their bosses or threaten to light the textile factories on fire, things like that. 1812, a frame-breaking act was passed making it punishable by death to destroy any kind of a stocking frame, is what we're talking about here. So that put an end to that. It's very important to put this in context, though, and Stephen Jones does this in his book Against Technology. He says we have to remember the historical Luddites were themselves technologists. That is, they were skilled machinists and masters of certain specialized techniques. That living and their right to their technology was what they fought to protect, not some romantic idyll in an imagined pre-technological nature. So it's important to remember that the original Luddites themselves were technicians of sorts. They weren't proto-romantic in any way. They were trying to protect their way of living. Jumping forward to what has been called the Neo-Luddites, you can think of people like Stuart Brand or Ted Nelson, for example, hypertext hippies, and we might say Technoromantics. As Stuart Brand put it, revolutionaries who want to deinstitutionalize society and empower the individual. So I want to move to this idea of the digital humanist as Neo-Luddite and what that might mean. Let's skip a couple of slides here. So there are various forms of Neo-Luddism. This isn't an exhaustive overview of them. You can think of black hat, anarchist Neo-Luddists, black hat hackers, or the Unabomber, for example. Environmental Neo-Luddism, such as the Earth First movement, California Croppers, or the Deep Ecology movement. And economic Neo-Luddism, the hypertext hippies, for example, or culture jammers, kind of ad-buster culture, which actually brings us to this. So what does Neo-Luddism have to do with maker culture? So is there this sense of Neo-Luddism within maker culture itself? And I would say yes, that the maker culture is essentially one of the zeitgeists in which its position is this desire to return to some form of manipulable materiality. So there's some optimism around this, and Stephen Jones says, today's Neo-Luddites look to the Luddites for the moral authority of working class experience, a grounding in material realities that seem increasingly elusive in today's alienated, technologically mediated virtual economy. So this desire for the material in a dematerialized kind of economy. There's also some pessimism about this. Chellis Glendenning, in Notes Toward a Neo-Luddite Manifesto, discusses the possibility of looking at this kind of movement as a leaderless movement of passive resistance to consumerism. So you see something like Arduino, which used to be a very sort of sketchy, it is still open source, sketchy kind of device that you would use to hack something together, you can now purchase in very nice packages that are kind of these fetishizable sort of kits that you can get. And this is basically regarding the arts and crafts movement, but the idea of maker culture being a revivifying hobby for the affluent is something that has to be considered as well, especially in the context of the digital humanities. So before we try to apply some of this to the digital humanities, we might ask, what are the digital humanities? And this was discussed a little bit, touched on yesterday a little bit. We think of the digital humanities, we usually think of these things. Digital archiving, text encoding, concordancing, data mining, data visualization, and research collaboration tools. And eCrit essentially suggests that this alchemical transformation of humanities research did not result in the creation of new experimental scholarly methods, but an academic fever for digital archiving and accelerated hermeneutics, both of which replicate and render more efficient traditional scholarly practices that belong to the print apparatus. So the idea here is, one of the criticisms of digital humanities is that it's essentially replicating the same kinds of scholarly work that has been done for hundreds of years. So can we think of digital humanities, traditionally how we think of digital humanities, can we think of it as Neo-Luddism? We can levy these critiques that, is it anarchistic? It's often the opposite. It's designed for establishment purposes to make the humanities practical, for example. Is it environmental? We could argue that a lot of the projects supported in digital humanities research involve the purchase of equipment that essentially leads to e-waste problems, and there are links there I can't show you that involve projects that have been funded and then gone to cobweb. And then economic is digital humanities. Can we see it as an economic kind of neo-Marxist Neo-Luddism? It's often the opposite. It often involves grant opportunism, uncritical technological enthusiasm, where calling yourself a digital humanist puts you in a position to get a lot of funding. So the relationship between the digital humanities and maker culture is one in which there's a shared historical and class context, where the class essentially is white collar and the historical context is in an innovation culture. So humanists trying to make themselves relevant within this culture of innovation and essentially commercialization and patenting, etc. So what would a digital humanities Neo-Luddism look like is what I'm trying to say. If those things aren't Neo-Luddistic, what would it look like? I've crossed out the D here because ultimately I agree with certain scholars, digital humanities scholars among them, who say there are no digital humanities, but there should be no digital before the word humanities, that what you do in the humanities is the humanities, that the digital media aspect of that should just be part of your practice, and you should alter your practices based on the tools you're using, but not set out to create a separate kind of privileged discipline that is called the digital humanities. So remember this quote by Jones that the historical Luddites were themselves technologists, skilled machinists and masters of certain specialized techniques. That living in their right to their technology was what they fought to protect. How much time is left, Nick? About 5? Okay. So we could say, what is our technique? I guess the practices of literacy would be the primary technique of humanists. What are we fighting to protect? I would argue things like deep reading, careful writing, contemplation, which is something that's increasingly squeezed out of our culture, critical analysis, face-to-face dialogue, etc. And what are the techniques at our disposal? Not sledgehammers, but possibly anything from sledgehammers to 3D printers. I only have a few minutes left. I was going to talk about William Blake, which might seem oddly random, but this is a humanities thing. I often talk about Blake as a practice-based researcher. We can't really call Blake a Luddite, although he did reject the idea of progress, empire, crown, his Jacobin sympathies, and he wrote a song about dark satanic mills that was co-opted to be played before rugby matches and things like that to celebrate British history. But Blake had a shared historical and class context with the Luddites. We can call Blake a neo-Luddite, actually. And I'm interested in Blake's own practice-based research processes, which Blake invented his own method of printing, relief etch printing that involved using acids on copper plates, etc. And what interests me about this is that he was essentially fusing a technological apparatus and a cultural apparatus. You could see some of What Blake was working to fight against were things like mechanical engraving. Blake lost a huge commission to Louis Schiavinetti, the fashionable Italian engraver, in the late 1700s. Blake created a series of prints for color design for Robert Blair's The Grave, and Schiavinetti essentially stole his commission. These prints were turned into line engravings and mass-produced. Blake looked at these kinds of line engravings, called them the nets and gins and traps to catch the joys of eternity. Here he's actually referencing bureaucratic institutions like churches, hospitals, castles, and palaces, and that's the whole point, is that Blake viewed his artistic practice, his making practices, he spoke about them with the exact same language as he spoke about his poetry and his politics. So they were one and the same. So we can draw some tenets for a make-oriented DH Neo-Luddism from Blake. I've skipped some things, so this may seem to be quite an extrapolation, but the idea here is not to make tools for humanists, use the humanities to make tools for humanity, and maybe for non-humans too. And how one is to liberate innovation from the logic of commercialization. I can speak more about that if anyone's interested. Engage technology at the R&D stage of development, adopt early and repurpose, intervene in the production of technoculture rather than responding to it after the fact, work in proximity with tech firms and startups, and prioritize thinking over selling as a production model, and create objects to think with. So I think I have 1 minute left. I don't have much time to talk about the projects I want to talk about. They're documented in my book Necromedia, which is just released. So here's Cycle of Dread, which is a project actually based on Blake's work. It involves a penny farthing bicycle on a disused walkway over a street, a main street in Kitchener. And people were invited to pedal the penny farthing bicycle and make the soul of Blake's strong, wicked man fly across the walkway, and according to your speed, the speed changed and your heart rate changed, the appearance. And why this project? It might seem very odd, and that's the whole point, is that it was odd. The project began with thinking about Blake and issues of embodiment, etc. We didn't know where it was going, and I think that's another thing that was said yesterday regarding creativity, which is that in order for projects, this type of cross-disciplinary project to be creative, you really should know how it's going to end up when you start the project. The project involved thinking about things like flow, Mihail Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, remapping it to involve existential dread and immersion, thinking about Blake's own issues, and issues of embodiment, etc. So I have other projects in here, including a project called Teat Tweet that involved looking at the way technology mediates relationships between humans and animals, and setting up 12 cows on a robotic dairy farm with Twitter accounts and having them tweet their milking activities based on an AI engine that we created. That was done with a visiting researcher in the lab. Myth of the Steersman, which is a commission project that involves Tom Thompson, Canadian painter Tom Thompson, and creating basically a haptic canoe wrapped in fishing line that can be activated from outside of the gallery from anyone with web access, and they can take over what's happening inside on the canoe inside the gallery. Student projects involve having students make arcade cabinets and develop critical games for them. Hacking, neuro games, doing things, cross-species kinds of investigations between cockroaches and mechatronic insects. More recently, through a project I'm working on called Digital Chastity, a student developed a digital chastity belt prototype, which gives you a shock when you pull it out, which can be a pleasurable thing, if you like that sort of thing, or it can actually be a deterrent. Depends where you wear it, I suppose. And you'll see an image of Nick here, who I recruited into the Church of the Digital Tabernacle. More recently, a project we're working on in the lab involves repurposing rituals from Catholic religion in order to create new digital rituals that foster contemplation rather than distraction. So this particular one involved taking away devices from people at an event. We did this at Nuit Blanche, Toronto last year, locking away their devices and giving them a card to contemplate their digital sins and then confessing their digital sins and setting them off to, we're recording the whole things on these life logging cross cameras that we hacked and created. And the last project I'll leave you with, just recently, we did it last weekend, I think, is called Burden of Communication, where we transubstantiate tweets about digital sins into bricks and carry them around the clock tower in Victoria Park in Kitchener in order to help to alleviate people of the burden of their digital communications. So I know I went really fast. I'm sorry, but you can ask questions. Thank you.
So our final presenter is Owen Chapman, Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Montreal wing of the Mobile Media Lab at Concordia, as well as you have some connections with Hexagram as well, right? Or, yeah. Yeah.
Being here, and my other panelists for starting the conversation in such stimulating ways. So I'm going to be working both with notes and reading some text that I've been developing in terms of the project near the end of the presentation. I'm going to start by doing a bit of reading and then be speaking more off the top of my head and finish by reading. So you see here the title that I submitted for the conference and then the team of research assistants that have contributed to the project. So I just want to highlight some of the roles that have been involved before I get into some substantive descriptions. Eric Powell has been particularly vital to the work since the beginning. He's been helping to find examples of different pre-existing open source projects that could inspire this one, the Audio Toy Box project. Sorry, I guess I should have reviewed the title. The Audio Toy Box project, building customizable communication therapy toys using radio frequency identification. And formerly my title had RFID technology in there. I brought some examples of the toys over here, and I'm going to be showing videos later on. So Eric has been very vital, and so he's been providing examples of other projects and also developing the code and the hardware that's integrated, the circuitry that's integrated into the current toy designs. Michelle Macklem has provided much of the vocal recordings, which you'll be hearing soon enough, along with Natalie Arcelanian. And Luciano has been developing our web presence, which we're just getting started with. Claire created our initial set of graphics. And Holly Shaw is a speech and language pathologist who's working at the Montreal located MAB Mackay Rehab Center, where some of the Audio Toy Box toys are going to be tested soon, and with whom I have consulted on our initial set of words that we're using with our first toy. So I'll explain all that in a minute. In terms of the title, if I were to update it now, I think I would reflect a little more in the title what I'm going to be saying about research creation, questions of artistic merit, the production of artworks as deliverables, and critical making. The Audio Toy Box project per se, I will be describing as an example of a type of what I believe to be a firmly research creation type of work, but which problematizes assumptions around the accessibility of artistic merit in terms of evaluating research creation outcomes. To give away my punchline before I really begin, I look to critical making as a concept or term, and the focus there on process that is central to this emerging term as a way out of potentially entrenched difficulties emerging with recent emphases on artwork as deliverable components of research creation initiatives. So first, I'm going to quickly review what I read as a subtle switch in terms of Shirk's definition of research creation. As a side note, I'll just say that you know, a lot of us have been referring to these institutional definitions of research creation, whether it's Shirk or FQRC or the Canada Council or whatever. Giselle gave a great talk yesterday that included some of those definitions. And you know, one might wonder why we keep reaching to these institutional definitions. I think it's because so many of us, students and faculty alike, understand that there's a lot of nuance and disagreement in terms of what research creation is. And like Shirk and these funding bodies, they provide maybe an arbitrary but a consistent and what is perceived as a broadly accepted definition for some of these elusive terms. So we constantly go back to them, and I'll be doing that again today. Then I'll quote myself, which is a fun thing to do, and Kim Sawchuk around the notion of creation as research, which is another neologism we've put together, and then other cognate terms for research creation that are components of so many of the different discussions that we've had, that we've been hearing so far during this conference, including the many terms discussed during yesterday's open area plenary. I will then finish this first part of the presentation with a look at Matt Rado's 2011 description of critical making, but that was just updated for us a little bit by Ginger, so my points are likely maybe going to be a little bit dusty today, but there you go. In the second section, I will turn to a short description of the Audio Toy Box project with audio and video examples. This will be accompanied with some examples of other initiatives that have inspired and informed the Audio Toy Box project. And in my concluding section, while I'll be reading a little bit more, kind of like I'm reading now, we'll situate the project in a critical disability studies framework, showing how such work allows for a type of participatory ethnographic method for research that fits perfectly with the types of descriptions outlined in part 1 in terms of how research creation can help, and I'm quoting Shirk here, the development of knowledge and innovation through artistic expression, scholarly investigation, and experimentation. So I'll just start with a tiny description of the Audio Toy Box project to situate this, and I'll post Bart behind me so it seems like he would approve of what I'm about to say. The Audio Toy Box project is about making and sharing sound-centered, interactive, creative children's toys. Small, brightly themed objects built from simple materials such as cardboard. The toys integrate mini speakers attached to simple, do-it-yourself electronic circuits that allow digital audio files to be triggered through different means. These include buttons and switches, as well as radio frequency identification, or RFID sensors. For those who don't know, RFID is the kind of stuff that we carry around with our new Visa cards. I mean, you can flash payments and things like that. The toys that we've made are designed for and with preschool children with global developmental delay, a term that applies to children with difficulties in 2 or more areas of development, such as communication, cognitive functioning, or fine and gross motor skills. Our circuits, code, and physical interface models are being made freely available through our website in order to help get them into the hands of children, their families, and therapists, and also as an open invitation for those interested to help evolve this work, as we have borrowed the open source designs of others. The toys are meant to be highly customizable, with easy-to-switch sounds that can be freely downloaded from our website or recorded at home. They are adaptable in terms of different therapy goals, emphasizing sound-based cause and effect interactions, speech and language skills like phonetic pronunciation, and fundamental communication activities like taking turns. So now I'm going to turn to discuss some of these definitions of research creation, like I was saying. So this is drawn from the most recent research creation definition you can find on Shirk's website. I'm sure other people are posting this during the conference here. So, and for me, what really resounds through this quote, I've highlighted in red, but an approach to research that combines creative and academic research practices and supports development of knowledge and innovation. There's that innovation term there. We can agree to some of this. But for me, what becomes of vital importance and significant is these lines around artistic assessment and art forms. So the creation process is situated within the research activity and produces critically informed work in a variety of media, and then for some reason there's this parenthetical addition of art forms. Research creation cannot be limited to the interpretation or analyses of a creator's work. Okay, we can debate that. And then finally, the research creation process and the resulting artistic work are judged according to Shirk's established merit review criteria. So you have this combination of questions of assessment, of evaluation, and then basing that in notions of merit, and merit is somehow being attached to art here. If we go back a little bit, now without using the Wayback Machine or something like that, I couldn't find the original quote that Kim and I, Kim Sawchuk, who's a colleague with whom I lead the Mobile Media Lab here at Concordia, and a major figure at our university, she and I wrote this paper in 2011 trying to address some of the emerging issues around research creation as we saw it, and we quoted Shirk at the time. And so the definition has changed subtly, but we still see that research creation is about an approach that forms an essential part of a creative process or artistic discipline, and that directly fosters the creation of literary or artistic works. So there's that the notion that there's a kind of deliverable in artistic work that happens at the end. I don't know about you, I find that there's something a little bit softer about this definition. It suggests other types of output, including literary output, so one could imagine different forms of creative writing or critical writing that would be a part of a type of outcome. So for me, there's a little bit more openness here. And I wonder why the switch in terminology to having this very strong articulation of deliverables as artworks being associated with research creation. So in response to that, kind of pervasive attitude, Kim and I wrote another paper recently where we tried to take up some of these issues. And creation as research, which is kind of an outcome of our thinking around research creation from 3 years ago, as one kind of mode in which research creation works. And so for us, creation as research is approached as it's research, it's approached as a form of understanding the term research as both noun and verb at the same time. So the idea is that we're producing research, we're accumulating knowledge, we're making contributions, but there's an activity that's involved in that. And we want to highlight both those things with creation as research. And we also want to insist that this type of activity should not be perceived strictly as a stand-in for art making. To assert that making is a form of research practice in academia, and I think we've been hearing about this already this afternoon in with some excellent examples, is to recognize the ever-increasing role of digital media production for scholars, whether this is through participation in social media, websites, online forms of publication, etc. And I think what Marcel was just saying about the digital humanities, maybe not needing that precursor term of digital being attached to it, reflects this attitude that Kim and I share around just digital tools being a part of research now. But we can recognize the gist, what lies in between the creative ways of knowing and expressing what we think we know, and what links them in different ways. So this requires recognizing the benefits of a network of terms of references linked to research creation. So then we have critical making, creationist research, practice-led research, digital humanities. You can add your own list there. Each of which carries its own nuances in terms of explaining the different ways one can learn through doing. And so now I'm quoting Matt Rado's text, who I have to admit I only encountered somewhat recently in writing about these topics, somewhat ignorantly of the term itself. When I first heard it used in a PhD defense about a year ago, critical making, to describe the work of the student who was defending his thesis, I thought, wow, this is a really interesting concept, and I need to learn more about it, and started digging into it, found Matt Rado's work quickly, and Garnet Hertz and others. And it was particularly the focus on process and the lack of, as you were pointing out this morning, not long ago, 45 minutes ago, the lack of an emphasis on these deliverables, these ultimate outcomes kind of going out into the world and being mass-produced or representing the lab in some way. So briefly put, the issue I want to understand is the seeming disconnect between deterministic conceptual understandings of the role of technology in social life and the more material and nuanced understanding of how one relates to them. Our goal is therefore to use material forms of engagement with technologies to supplement and extend critical reflection and, in doing so, to reconnect our lived experience with technologies to social and conceptual critique. So, what I want to say is exactly, with my own approach, and I think this is shared by many colleagues in maybe not the fine arts related disciplines that have been a part of Hexagram or, these types of associations historically, but the humanities-based or social science-based researchers, research creators who are producing and making work and trying to think through it at the same time. Our focus is not always about producing art. There are many other angles, and it's as much about social commentary and intervention, and then just finding ways to engage with and interact with the technologies that we take for granted in everyday life. All right. We've jumped, the video started right away. So now I'm going to turn to the second portion of what I wanted to talk about. And I'm going to show a few examples of how these toys that we've been making work, and I'm going to try to situate them in the discussion a little bit. So this first toy, the audio toy box project, the ambition is, we've only just got it started, but the ambition is to try to produce many designs. Our first design we call the Alphabet Radio, and I brought it today. Here's a video of it. Hopefully my sound is going to be loud enough.
Cow. Bus.
This is Michelle Macklin's voice. You'll hear it again later.
Chicken. Cat.
I threw that in there just to demonstrate another type of possibility. Obviously, we're working with words to begin with, but there's a lot of different kinds of sounds that this type of platform could accommodate. I was using this in the kitchen at home. The idea is this is a domestic object that will be hanging around the house and that kids would go to and use spontaneously. One of the things that children with global developmental delay need to do often are repetitive play-based therapeutic tasks that are often situated around toys. And the initial idea, kernel of the idea, came from the fact that one of my own children was diagnosed is not the right term, but was titled with global developmental delay at an early age in her development and started participating in various therapeutic environments, therapeutic activities. And I quickly noticed that if the toys that were being presented to her in order to instigate certain types of therapy, if they integrated any sound component at all, it was usually terrible and mostly non-existent. And so we started trying to think about different ways that we could make toys that would be engaging on a sonic level. Here's my daughter Ella on the right of the screen, and I'll just play a little audio example. If we could turn the audio up just a little bit for this one example. This is her playing with the toy at home just the other day. Here, if you put that down, you can try it with one of the cards here. Oh, there you go. Oh, try again.
Cow.
Good.
You got it.
Yeah. Why don't you try that one?
Baby.
Push your hand. Yeah.
Cat.
Oh, you want cat?
Cat.
Here you go. Do you want to try cat? Push it to the middle here. That's it. One of the things I find with Ella is often under her breath, she's using the words that she's practicing. We just can't hear her. So I don't know if you could hear. She was whispering cat like many times before she finally got the word out. And that's what this toy can provide, is a way for her to engage on her own in different moments. Now, I'm talking about my own kid here. Soon I'll explain how we're going to be moving away from this and trying to extend this to other testing scenarios, putting it out there into the world, which is an intimidating type of thing to do. It's easy for me to showcase this stuff now because it's coming out of my own domestic sphere. Here are the guts of the alphabet radio, so you can see the Arduino up in the top right-hand corner, which is the kind of brains. The RFID sensor you can't see here, but it's a small, about 1-inch square object which is glued to the top of the box, and when you flash the card over it, it sends a unique code to the Arduino, and that code is matched to a sound file. You can see there's like a memory chip on the side of the Arduino, which can easily be swapped out, and as long as you number your files 0 to 14, they can be anything at all. They have to be formatted to a certain type of file format, but the idea here is you can swap those out easily, and you could record your own sounds, or you could download sounds from our website, and you could add different sounds that are specific to the types of words or phonetic forms of pronunciation or sounds that a child is working on in terms of a therapeutic goal. This project was inspired by some works that, as I said, Eric found while we were doing our research for creation, while we were kind of getting started and bringing different ideas together. The first one was this project called the Rfid Jukebox, which is, as you can see, we almost directly copied the idea. We even directly copied a lot of the code. This came from a website where the code is being freely distributed so that people can improve and work on it and upload their own ideas. So this was meant for an able-bodied child who just liked to be able to, who was literary, I guess. That she wasn't able to like type in words and things in terms of sounds that she wanted to hear, music that she wanted to hear. So the cards were a quick shorthand way of her playing back her favorite songs as a type of toy. That project was linked to another project which we found on the Instructables website, which this is an interactive kind of electrified PlayStation. So when a child touches those various knobs and devices, according to how they touch them, they get different types of feedback, both sonic and a little bit of like shock stimulus, and lights go off and various things. The idea here being, again, with a child who has a physical disability or some type of developmental delay, that this can help with different kind of daily activities. And it's a different way of reinforcing the therapeutic goals. This project came out of a group called DIY Ability, who are based in New York, and they are regularly, again, like sharing and exchanging this type of open source, do-it-yourself, Arduino hacker maker-based ideas for how to work on specifically projects and devices that can help improve the lives of people with disabilities. Around Christmas time, around this time of year, they start having these hack-a-toy workshops where people bring electronic toys in, and then you figure out how to put different switches and different kinds of accessibility components into the toy so that children with disabilities can use them more accessibly. This website and project was linked to another place in New York City where I went and visited. It's called the Adaptive Design Association, run by a woman named Alex Truesdell. At the Adaptive Design Association, they have a cardboard construction ethos, and they're working with cardboard construction designs, again, mostly to produce, well, different stations, different types of seating arrangements, different types of kind of posturepedic appropriate accommodations or customizations for children, again, with particular disabilities, which mean that they need help in terms of like sitting at the table or participating in a reading circle or that kind of thing. So the goal here is to bring therapists and parents into the site to teach them some basic cardboard construction techniques, and then get them designing and participating in building different accommodations and customizations that can help improve the lives of the children that they're working with.
And so you can see the designs that we've been taking up for the toys that we're making are built in cardboard and simple to acquire, simple to reproduce substances and materials. We initially were thinking about speccing hard plastic and 3D printing our toys and this kind of stuff, and we quickly realized that that would limit its accessibility and also pose certain other issues around like getting tossed around and broken, and how would we fix them easily. And so anything that's made out of cardboard is very quick to repair and replace. Here's the DJ Junior. There's another platform. Might need a little more volume there, sorry. Yeah, it's kind of low. That's Ella's favorite. That's not my favorite. This next one is though. So this was actually developed by students of mine in an undergraduate class in communication studies. There were actually two classes that came together, and teams of 4 were given that basic circuit that we had come up with the RFID sensor that produced sound, and then they were tasked with developing a game out of it. And so there were drinking games that were developed. There were all sorts of things that came out of it. But this project in particular I found really quite something. And it's a pretty simple idea. You saw it in effect there. The cards, instead of playing back words, are playing back little samples of popular music. And a child, you could dial in the exact songs that they're into. And Ella is super motivated to play with this toy. It's the kind of thing she wants to go back and play the songs again and again and again. And it reinforces all sorts of types of, enriching, therapeutic types of activities when she's working with it. So there's a website. We're just getting started, and it's it's kind of more of a placeholder now. If you want to follow the project, please have a look. And that's the end of the presentation on the slide level. I am going to conclude with just a couple of pages of text if I have time. Yeah. Okay. So I want to situate this a little bit in some theoretical discourse. The field of critical disability studies considers how institutions, cities, or societies disable people systematically and socially. One of the key points of the field is to underscore the ways that normative assumptions about the body, cognition, and perception operate on ableist terms that promote a limited range of understanding what it means to be human. The Audio Toy Box project seeks to intervene into the state of affairs in a strong way, presenting alternative frameworks for developing and sharing non-ableist, affordable, and adaptable or customizable toy designs. This research creation project approaches the study of disability from an interdisciplinary perspective and questions cultural narratives and discourses that posit disability as inherently tragic for individuals and families. Simply put, what I want to say is that research creation is a way of thinking, and I'm echoing a little bit what Marcel was just saying. For me, lately, research creation is a way of thinking orally about and with persons with disabilities. I think the Audio Toy Box project is poised to make a variety of different contributions. This conference presentation is one of them. I think the project is also an example of some of the important synonymous qualities between research creation and critical making as terms, while also highlighting various affordances in terms of the types of questions and approaches the two terms describe slightly differently. Research creation, as I have outlined, is unfortunately generally characterized as resulting in the production of artworks, if we follow Shirk. While critical making is often employed in regards to kind of more hacking and open source computing and making communities. But of course there's counterexamples there, plenty to look at. Tinkering processes, tactical interventions, that kind of stuff. But neither of these delimitations, however, are semantically necessary in terms of the words used to describe research creation, critical making. What can only be understood as like parallel, if not identical, forms of scholarly method. Research creation, for instance, has always been in large degree about process. So there's authors we can look to here like Natalie Lovelace and Sophie Stevens and Aaron Manning and Brian Masumi, who talk a lot about process. Critical making shares this explicit sympathy. So Ratto and Hertz have both pronounced this fairly strongly in terms of their writing around critical making. The upshot is that research creation in its relationship to critical making should not be seen as essentially wedded to the production of art objects, works of art, or even necessarily any particular types of outcomes altogether, especially considering the explicit and consistent focus on practice that I think we all want to celebrate when we're talking about research creation. Secondly, I think projects like the Audio Toy Box project, point out potential links between critical disability studies, DIY maker culture, and therapeutic context. And I was fascinated to learn about this new 3D printing initiative. It's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. And bridging, this kind of bridging is starting to emerge in many different labs. So we have DIY abilities. We have the Augmented Use Musical Instrument Project, otherwise known as the ALMI project, which is spearheaded by Ellen Waterman and Pauline Oliveros and Eric Lewis here at McGill. We have Jason Nolan's EDGE lab at Ryerson University, which is working quite explicitly with the Adaptive Design Association in New York. We have Sarah Hendren's work. We have what we do at the Mobile Media Lab. We have the Critical Making Lab, many examples in a variety of places. And I think the triangulation between critical disability studies, DIY maker culture, and therapeutic contexts also presents a really fertile and highly participatory environment for ethnographic and other forms of qualitative research. So we're going to be going to MIB Mackay and sharing these toys with other families and getting feedback in terms of what they think works and what they don't think works. And we're in a participant action research model, we're going to be improving and making the toys, customizing them for the contexts that are specific to each of the children and each of the families and therapists that are taking up the toys. Lastly, and I'll conclude, this is what I'm trying to start to work through now. I'm hoping that the Audio Toy Box project can provide a foundation from which I can build a sustained consideration of the purported dichotomy between physical and intellectual or cognitive disabilities. Here we can point to critical disability studies work that cites disability not as a trait or medical condition or impairment, but as a social situation in which we may all find ourselves one day, and those we love, to varying degrees. This wake-up call is extended as a mechanism, among other goals, of pointing out ableism at its core within critical disability studies. It's a consistent social cultural bias and blind spots that lead to multiple forms of non-empathetic thinking or a lack of consideration altogether of the needs and horizons of possibility for disabled people in today's society. There are connections that can be made arguably between mental illness and intellectual disability, but social cultural taboos around the specter of mental enfeeblement, and I'm drawing a term here from Lisa Carlson, who's done some work around philosophy and mental illness. The social cultural taboos around this type of determination are such that a sustained and multi-voiced critique of the putative categorical distinction between physical and cognitive disabilities in terms of social status and medical treatment is not really to be found. Or maybe it's just eluded my preliminary research for creation. I may still need to find the right texts. But one exception, although I think it's a limited exception, is in the case of preschool-age children with developmental delay who are without a diagnosis. So if you're diagnosed with Down syndrome or something, you're very quickly streamlined into an intellectual disabilities category. But if you're in that undiagnosed place up until your school age, you're allowed to kind of remain in between. And this is what is the case with most of the children at MIB Mackay who I've encountered who are below age 5. This is their scenario. And so in Quebec, they're provided with services that are related principally just to enriching their developmental environments. And it doesn't distinguish the cause or the nature of their emerging disabled title. So the Audio Toy Box project is dedicated towards developing toys and platforms and sharing these designs as mechanisms of demonstrating the arbitrariness of this differentiation, especially in preschool-age children, but also long afterwards, once the system has already made determinations regarding how children are slotted moving forward in terms of access to therapeutic and medical services, respite for parents, transportation, education, childcare, employment, social opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Owen. So we have just over 10 minutes for comments or questions. We have to be out of here at 3 on the dot, so I have a couple questions, but I'd like to open it to the audience. Yeah?
I have a question for you. I would like to know what is art for you first, and second, why I feel that what you are doing, you don't feel that it's art. So can you answer?
Yeah, exactly. Perhaps it's an insecurity on my part. I guess I should talk into the microphone. I would agree. With this project in particular, I don't feel like it fits into that category of art. I would fear what would happen. And in fact, when I applied to SSHRC for the Insight Development Grant last year, I didn't click the research creation box because of the specific description of artistic merit assessment as being a part of how it would be evaluated. In another sense, I could argue, especially with like DJ Junior or something, we're dealing with artistic practices that are being lifted out of DJ culture, out of other situations of performativity where we could easily describe them as art. But in this context, again, and the types of outcomes that we're looking for with the families and people who are getting involved, it's not so much about the aesthetics of the experience as it is about the process of coming together and then being able to talk to them about what this kind of device means in their everyday life. That's the focus of the research. So, I mean, we could talk a little bit more, and I think maybe that's part of the problem with situating artistic merit in such a strong way within the definition of research creation, because then we get into this debate around what's art, right? And who wants to go back to that debate?
Is this live? Oh, okay. But just to follow up on that and on what you were saying about Shirk, I did click the research creation box last year, and I had a research creation grant that was expiring, and I wanted to renew, and I didn't get the grant, and I was told that the type of work that I did was not considered fine art. So, but I mean, but that being said, what I'm trying to get at is that I think there could be different lives for these kinds of projects. So, Audio Toy Box could certainly be a therapeutic device, can also be an object to think with, could certainly be part of an exposition somewhere. I think it's important to think about the different lives that these projects can take on. I think I'm also trying to say something here to the Critical Making Lab as well, which is that I mean, I understand Matt Rauda's objections to keeping these products, to not keeping these products because they may be held up for fetishization, but at the same time, I think we can separate process and creating a process-based thing and then going through a second stage of making that thing presentable to the public. So I would, you know, if he was here, I would duke it out, but maybe you want to duke it out instead, I don't know.
I will actually, because I've spent 6 years doing the duking it out, because I come from an art background, or a design background, both. And I spent my first year in the critical making lab saying, yeah, but why can't you do both? And, you know, the conclusion I've come to in the last several years is that there are people who can do it both, and there are people who have not yet been trained to do both. And I think that that training in doing both, in having a reflexive practice while you do something and still being able to make it presentable and worthwhile to a viewer afterwards, is something that, for example, you get trained into in art. But it's not something that people are trained into outside of art, or, you know, other cognate fields. But then there is a question about what the lives of these things are supposed to be and what the value is to different people, right? Which is something that we've been fighting with in our implementation of the 3D printed prosthetics project. So, what are the different lives of it? And where are the values to different people?
Anyone else in the audience? Yeah.
I'm going to try saying something unpopular here. So, when Shirk and FRC started started that program up, artists in the academy were the only group, I think, that were not funded. There was no, you go to the county council, except that you were discouraged from doing that at the county council because you had a job, right? So that was really designed to open up academic funding to people who had practices that didn't fit anywhere else, that couldn't appeal either to use value. They couldn't claim, although there are many artists now doing social work-based art, relational-based art. It's a big, interesting mess, and probably great that way. But there certainly are there's a big community of artists still doing stuff that, in some ways, I think it's close to some of the work Marcel showed. So things that that are open to very ambiguous interpretation, very open, very porous, and don't have any obvious defendable use value and that kind of thing. So I think it's very interesting to argue that we might want to say that things have changed, or like finesse the thing, or sort of talk about it in new ways, renew it. But it does come from a specific situation.
Yeah, I've always kind of assumed and been told that that was the case. But then we get into discussions around, like, well, if we're defining terms like research creation is the aim here, then we have a series of considerations that need to be put on the table. If funding, fine arts-based scholars is the aim here, then it's another series of considerations that need to be put on the table. And I think that there's a unfortunate kind of dovetailing that's happening, and people are confused, and it leads to issues around confusion in terms of assessment and how things will be evaluated. So we had two very different examples right here of our anxiety over whether or not to tick that box, and I think students share that anxiety too. And your point is well made around how maybe what we need is simply like an update. And one point that I would try to take to shirk, although I've tried a few times and not gotten very far, is that parenthetical reference to art forms to me seems entirely unnecessary. Like if we could just stop it. Research creation projects often result in the production of different forms of media, period. That might be an interesting move forward.
But maybe, according to Nelson Goodman, art is not what it is. It's when we have art. So you have to challenge what the definition of art. Instead of erase art, we can change the definition. And when you write a research creation submission, put something like that can challenge what you think art is.
Mm-hmm.
You have to change the consideration around the word.
I definitely share that orientation, and that's generally what I would do. I do feel a little bit for slightly more vulnerable, scholars or emerging scholars or whatever to try to make those decisions. It could be a little bit more difficult, but I definitely appreciate what the point is, and maybe that's the argument that has to be made. It's a question of
you can work with artists,
mm-hmm.
and you can show it's something in between disciplines. Research creation is something in between, maybe. So maybe you have to find people that can put your research in a museum or in a concert, and you can work with them and bring something to them too.
I don't want to dominate. Yeah, there's other people who probably want to respond to that.
Just on that note, I agree very much. I think I used to be very resistant to calling any of the things that I did art, and refused, and realized after working with artists for a while that it was really unproductive to do that, and that I could work with artists and from a position of humility present these kinds of projects in an arts context and use them to ask certain kinds of questions that were welcome in arts communities. But it is very tricky politically to make certain claims about your work, to call it art. I'm sure you're familiar with some of those anxieties as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think it is can be a very productive thing to do.
Owen, as a musician, because you're a musician as well, and like taking all these considerations about research creation as a discipline, process, I think, and all these things, how do you conceive this idea of making transcending like this disciplinary grades, because in the end art is also like a limiting, right? Defining art is also a limiting. So how do you see this making from your position as an artist in another field?
Which making do you mean? Sorry.
The making of the toy.
Okay. Well, to me, there was a thread, that brought us here. It has to do a little bit with the interactivity of the platform, and thinking about interactive technologies for digital performance, musical digital performances, the new emerging platforms that allow you to sample and trigger things in all sorts of different ways. So there's that direct connection. There's also connections in terms of practice around like sampling sound sources and editing them and selecting them and thinking about how they're going to layer and how they're going to work together. So some of the ways that the Arduino was programmed are different between the DJ Junior and this device. DJ Junior, you can interrupt the sounds. This one, they have to play out before you play another one. So subtle technical things like that. But also I think on the level of just general sound studies kind of approaches to these considerations. I think that the performance aspects of even electronic music reproduction put it into a slightly novel category in terms of research creation, in terms of outcomes, because when you're playing back music and thinking about performances and stuff, you're already dealing in a kind of social intervention environment and not so much the production of outcomes. So I do see some of that too as a part of the background thinking to this work. Thank you.
Maybe just as a last comment, I don't know if we have time to address this, but on the one hand, we have the art deliverable and what is art. And the other hand, and I feel this particularly in the context of University of Waterloo, which is a very engineering-heavy institution and startup culture and we at the Critical Media Lab, we feel a lot of pressure from the pressure a little bit to monetize, to turn these into startup potential, you know, and I saw that actually with with both of your works and some of those, you know, toys in particular. I said, oh, we could turn this into like a Fisher-Price toy, etc., which I know seems to be at odds with all three of the kind of ethoi of the labs, which are process and ephemeral and thinking rather than products. So I was just curious how each person's negotiated that tension, or if that's something we just have the benefit of dealing with at Waterloo.
I'll be very quick, but just it's a discussion that's ongoing. So MAB Mackay, we're kind of wondering, like, what happens if you commercialize these things? What's our stake in it? The university's wondering that. And so my head in the sand response was like, it's all open source. It's all going to be up on the web. We're giving it all away for free. And that has to come a little bit, too, from the fact that I feel uncomfortable funneling research money into what then becomes a venture capital kind of thing. So that's where it's at right now. It's all open source, and it's all going to be shared.
Similarly, U of T has an exceptionally aggressive intellectual property office that really takes anything you produce that can be considered IP and tries to monetize it. And our solution has been to put it online for free. All of our source code is available for the majority of the things we do. We maintain our own Git repositories, and we adhere to those kinds of principles. And then our monetizable output is students who graduate and get jobs, right? That's our end run around it in terms of utility.
I mean, fortunately at Waterloo, it's a culture of we own our own IP. So like MIT, you own your research and you can pursue it. And I think this feeds back to something that Ginger, that you were saying in the beginning, which is these students working in the lab, when they do their projects, there's no end goal of commercialization. There's sometimes no end goal of the product itself. But when they're done, sometimes there are products that some may be commercializable. They may want to do that, they may not. Some may be worthy of an exhibition in a gallery. They may want to do that, they may not. But I think what we try to do is give them avenues to do those things, but it's not part of the lab. So they can go next door and create a startup and commercialize and try to patent their thing that they've developed. Or they can work with an artist or with a gallery to try to understand what it would take to move from this kind of process-based learning to an exhibition, to an installation, or some other kind of project. So I think we're in a fortunate position in that sense regarding the IP question. But you initially resisted it a great deal, the commercialization aspect, but realized let it happen, but not in the lab, I guess, is our philosophy.
All right, well, that's a good point to end. So thanks again for our three very stimulating presentations this afternoon.